Greetings and welcome to the side event GCF Simplified Approval Process for the Private Sector of the GCF Private Investment for Climate Conference. My name is Rocío Bizuete and I will be the moderator of this session, working alongside my colleagues from the SAP and Private Sector team. This webinar will be divided in two sections. Firstly, an introduction of the Simplified Approval Process, or SAP for short. And secondly, the role of SAP in the private sector, after which there will be a Q&A session. We would like this webinar to be interactive. I encourage all of you to post any written questions you may have in the WUBA window. During the Q&A session of the webinar, I will pose your questions to the speakers. If your questions are not answered live, we will provide written answers in WUBA. Please note that there won't be interpretation services during this webinar. However, feel free to post your questions in French and Spanish. To launch this webinar, I would like to introduce Dimitri Innocenti, the manager of the SAP, PPF, and EDA, who will share some welcome remarks. Dimitri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rossi. And to all of you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night if, like all of us, you are in South Korea or in Eastern Asia. On behalf of the Green Climate Fund, I would like to welcome all of you, representatives of the GCF, national designated authorities and focal points, accredited entities, private sector partners, all of you that are participating to this virtual event that will discuss how the simplified approval process that I will start to call SAP from now on can be instrumental to trigger impactful private sector investments in developing countries. My colleagues from the SAP team, Rossi will moderate the event and Katie will actually guide you through an introduction of the SAP. She will explain to you the features of this financing window that is designed to accelerate the preparation and the approval of certain type of GCF investments when certain criteria are met. Also, my colleagues from the private sector, Leo and Kate, will make real case examples of how the private sector actually has used the SAP with projects that have been approved. Since the SAP started its operation, and it was back in 2018, its pipeline of projects and programs have grown exponentially. It topped 20% of the entire pipeline of the Green Climate Fund in terms of a number of proposals that have been submitted for financing to the GCF. And these basically witness that there is a strong interest from countries, from accredited entities, from the GCF partners in taking advantage of a financing scheme that can accelerate the preparation and the approval of GCF investments. And of course, this is extremely important for private sector. As today, the SAP pipeline accounts 98 projects that have been submitted, and they request to GCF more than $800 million in climate finance, only from the fund, without counting the co-finance. The portfolio of approved projects is 16 projects so far, and they are operating in 15 countries already, and their total value in terms of finance is over $225 million. However, only 3 of these 16 approved SAP projects are from private sector, and actually one of them is a public-private partnership. So we have to do more for using SAP and private sector, and that was also remarked by the recent SAP review and the SAP assessment that the independent evaluation unit of the GCF has performed. These independent assessment basically tell us that the SAP can be relevant, very relevant to the private sector. However, it should do much more for the private sector. It should be simplified more than that. Actually, we also received a mandate from the board to prepare a new SAP policy that we are currently drafting, and we hope we can bring to the board as soon as possible. It will not be probably tabled for the next board meeting in November, but we have hopes that next year actually it can be tabled. With this new SAP policy, we intend to accelerate even further the easiness of access to GCF climate finance for private sector for low risk project. And I think I already took enough time. I really, as Rossi said, look forward an interactive discussion with all of you. This webinar is a unique occasion to hear your voices, the voices especially of those in the front line of private sector investments. We need actually to learn a lot from you if we want to make the simplified approval process. And I would say overall the climate finance that is provided by the GCF more relevant and more impactful for the private sector investment. So with this, I wish all of you a productive and most of all enjoyable hour with us. And over to you, Rossi.
Thank you for your warm welcome, Dimitria, and for introducing the topic of this webinar. I will just briefly introduce the panelists, as Dimitria has already done so. For this session, we first have Katie Bryson from the SAP team, who will provide a short overview of the SAP. And then we have our two panelists from the private sector team, Kate Tang and Leo Pad, who will present some examples of SAP projects and will provide an overview of the lessons learned. So let's begin. Katie, you have the floor to introduce the SAP to our audience.
Okay, thank you, Rocio. So yeah, I'm going to quickly run through an introduction of the simplified approval process and provide you with some background information before my PSF colleagues, Leo and Kate, dive in to the private sector SAP focus. So let's begin. I'm going to start off here with a little history of the SAP. It was approved as a pilot scheme at the GCF's 18th board meeting and then subsequently launched at COP23. The overall objective of the SAP is to reduce the time and effort needed in 4 key areas. Those are the preparation, the review, the approval, and disbursement procedures for low-risk projects. So with that objective in mind, there's 3 eligibility criteria for SAP. So only certain projects can go through the SAP funding window. And those eligibility criteria are, first of all, they have to be ready to be scaled up and/or have the potential for transformational impact. Secondly, they should request up to 10 million USD in GCF finance. So with co-financing, the project can exceed 10 million USD, but the limit is only on the GCF contribution. And finally, the project has to have minimal to no environmental and social risks. At GCF, this corresponds to category C. So if you think you have a project that's eligible for SAP, the first step is the submission of a concept note, which is mandatory for SAP. This is so GCF reviewers can determine the project's eligibility for SAP before moving on to the FP stage. The submission must be from a GCF accredited entity or national designated authority. And it is also important to note that submissions must be made through the online submission system, which is available through the AE's and NDA's apps portal on the GCF website. So in order to help our reviewers determine the eligibility of the concept note for SAP, it must also be submitted with an environmental and social safeguards screening checklist, which is Annex 1 of the concept note. The concept note cannot be submitted on the online submission system without this annex. So following the review of your concept note, the GCF reviewers will hopefully give it the go-ahead for the funding proposal stage. And at this stage, it must be submitted by the accredited entity. NDAs cannot submit a funding proposal for SAP. Submissions must follow the SAP funding proposal template, which has been significantly simplified with a reduced number of sections and streamlined annexes. We have also created a package of annex examples to aid the AEs in preparation of the annexes. As with the concept note, funding proposals must be submitted via the online submission system. So as I mentioned, one of the eligibility criteria is that SAP has to be low risk activities. So that's category C projects at GCF. So this is a list of some activities that could be eligible for SAP projects, and it's sort of looking more towards the private sector investment angle. As you can see, it's quite mitigation heavy, but there are also options for adaptation. A quick note that this is an indicative list, and also depending on specific circumstances of the project environment, these might not be SAPable, and that's why it's important to submit an ESS screening with a concept note. So to help you submit your concept notes and funding proposals, we have also published a series of materials and tools to help AEs and NDAs in the preparation of SAP projects, and many of these materials are available in English, Spanish, and French. So first of all, we have the SAP funding proposal guidelines, where a reader can find detailed explanations of what information is needed in each section of the funding proposal and its annexes. And to complement the FP guidelines, we have also developed an e-learning course on the development of funding proposals, providing a section-by-section guide and information on key topics for GCF, such as theory of change and paradigm shift potential. And you can also find SAP technical guidelines, which outline good practices, examples, and activities that may be eligible for SAP for each sector. To date, we have 7 technical guidelines available. They're mostly available in the mitigation sectors, and we are currently working to produce the remaining technical guidelines in other relevant sectors. We have also produced a number of webinars, sort of general introductions to SAP, an overview of the SAP for RED+, and an online tutorial on the online submission system. And I highly encourage you to give the online submission system webinar a listen if you're not familiar with the system. So a quick look at the future of SAP. As Demetrio said in his opening remarks, the SAP has been reviewed by the Secretariat, and the IEU has completed a rapid assessment of the SAP. Both the review and the IEU's rapid assessment gave a series of recommendations on how the SAP can be further improved. Based on these recommendations, and at the request of the GCF board, the Secretariat is creating a policy on the further development of the SAP. We're also looking to strengthen our support for DAEs in countries, and this is going to be done through a SAP technical assistance program for projects, and also by providing webinars, online and offline training workshops. And we will also continue our communication to stakeholders through the release of knowledge products such as videos, guidelines, and further e-learning development. And to finish off this brief introduction, this is where we stand as the SAP portfolio, which Demetrio already touched on. As he said, we have 16 approved projects totaling over 140 million in GCF financing. And as Demetrio said in his opening remarks, only 3 of these projects are from the private sector, and 1 is cross-cutting the private sector and public sector. So we look forward to hearing from you the ways we can make SAP more impactful in the private sector. And with that, I conclude my brief overview. Back over to you, Rocio.
Thank you, Katie, for your very insightful presentation of the simplified approval process. We will now proceed into the second part of the webinar. So Leo and Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Leo. I manage the financial institutions team within the private sector facility. So it is really a privilege, meeting all of you out there, although I can't really see you. And I'm happy to share our experience when it comes to developing and implementing SAP projects with a very strong private sector flavor. So can we go to the next slide, please? Thank Thank you. So, of course, in terms of process, etc., it is identical whether the project is public or private. So we are very flexible, as always, and we can again provide equal support for both public and private sector investments. Although one of our requirements when it comes to private sector project, I'd say is more of like rather than request, I would rather say our preference is to mobilize, private sector investments alongside GCF. So GCF, rather than being the sole investor of the project, we would rather, come in with our other investors by providing, more concessional resources than others. And we do believe that the SAP does provide the flexibility and the speed when it comes to, again, the processing the project compared to the regular funding proposal window. And given that private sector investors are very conscious of the timing, we do believe that SAP can provide and also meet that very specific needs of the private sector investors. And one of the, again, key advantage is to reduce the efforts in preparing all the documents. I mean, which can be deemed still heavy compared to, what you need to do with other organizations. But we do believe that, providing the right information is still necessary for us to, evaluate and also to make sure that we can indeed maximize our impact on the ground. Next slide, please. And we will share with you some of the examples on the private sector SAP project. So this is actually the very first private sector SAP project that has been approved back in 2018 with an accredited entity in Mongolia called XACBANK, which is a commercial bank, and they are actually the first commercial entity accredited to the GCF from developing country. So what they wanted to do, since they are a commercial bank, they wanted to shift the consumer preference by encouraging them to use more energy efficient equipment. And as you can imagine, this is what the commercial banks can do because they can really engage with individuals and households. So the theme was actually cross-cutting, not only the mitigation, because it also creates adaptation-related benefits as well. And the CO2 reductions was around 469,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. It can be again seen small, but again, please do note that this was an energy efficiency project, not like renewable energy project that is expected to reduce larger scale of emissions reductions. And then you can also see the beneficiaries, which was very promising. Because again, we are targeting households, so you can imagine that one house has quite a few members of the family. Usually, on average, is 4, sometimes larger when it comes to developing country context. And ESS, again, needless to say, was I-3, which is equivalent to category C, and the total financing was 21.5 million, which includes 9 million loan from GCF and 1 million grant from GCF as well. And then some of the grant facility is actually being used to dispose the old and less energy efficient equipment, because we wanted to avoid situation whereby these households or individuals, they keep the old or the less energy efficient equipment rather than get it replaced. Then because then they will not be the expected level of CO2 emissions reductions. And then we again, like I said in the beginning, we do partner with other institutions to the extent possible. So this time we did partner with not only XACBANK, who also provided their own funding, but also with the NGO who has provided some grant funding for the feasibility studies as well as other activities. And the duration of this project is for 10 years. So with this, I'll hand over to my colleague, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. My name is Kate, and I'll introduce the second private sector SAP project. The second project is the FIJI AGROPHOTOVOLTAIC project in OVALAU. by FIJI Development Bank, which was approved at B26. The project aims to finance a 4 megawatt solar agrophotovoltaic APV system and 5 megawatt battery energy storage system in OVALAU, Fiji, where they are currently 100% dependent on diesel generation. The project will allow simultaneous development of solar power generation with battery storage and enhance local agricultural production under the solar PV as a co-benefit. The project will provide on-granting for technical assistance to strengthen the capacity of local communities and to establish a climate project financing facility within FDB. The total financing for the project is $10 million US, of which $5 million will be provided by GCF, and that is $3.9 million in senior loan and $1.1 million in grants. And as for the co-financing, $1 million US in senior loan will be financed by FDB, and $4 million US in-kind contribution for the battery system will be financed by Korea International Cooperation Agency. The project is expected to reduce 0.9 million tons of CO2 equivalent over the 20-year project lifespan. And the project is expected to overcome barriers of financing, technical capacity, and limited availability of land by supporting an innovative technology that combines photovoltaic power generation and agricultural production. The project can serve as a proof of concept for the viability and bankability of renewable energy projects in Fiji with low environmental impact. Next slide, please. So what we learned from these private sector SAP projects is that the SAP projects can move to implementation very quickly. For example, SAP 004 by XACBANK took 238 days from the board approval till the first disbursement. And compared to the average number of days for the portfolio, which is about 500 days, the implementation period for this project was a record time. SAP projects are also ideal for the pilot projects that has potential to be scaled up and replicated, as seen in the SAP 16 FDB project. Once this pilot project in Fiji is implemented successfully, FDB plans to replicate this concept in other parts of the country, as well as the seed countries in the Pacific where they face similar challenges. Next slide, please. The key aspects of SAP project is that the review cycle is shorter and simpler compared to the PAP projects, which is for the regular projects. The review cycle for the SAP is 27 weeks, and the PAP is 35 weeks. It also requires less compared to the PAP, less documents compared to the PAP projects. For example, a full feasibility study and a market study, which is usually required for the PAP, is not needed for the SAP. SAP would only require a pre-feasibility study. And we also request the accredited entities to prepare the funding proposal package with significantly fewer pages and not to exceed 20 pages in total. And lastly, the SAP projects can be a good start for the accredited entities going through its first project with GCF. The accredited entities can get familiar with the GCF process before bringing large programs. And with that, I'll end the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate and Leo, for this very comprehensive presentation of the SAP and the private sector. We will proceed to the Q&A part of the session. I am really happy to say that we have a really engaged audience today with us, and we've already had a lot of questions. But please, you can continue posting your questions throughout the rest of the session. So I will start from the first questions from the audience, which is either Kate or Leo. Please, if you can answer, what kind of can you give examples of SAP private sector adaptation projects?
So SAP adaptation project, again, thank you very much, first of all, for a very interesting question. I think we have only 100% adaptation project that is within the private sector, if I'm not mistaken, the one in Haiti. Although this is actually a renewable energy program, I think we classify it as an adaptation project because it has more adaptation benefits in the local context. Because Haiti, as you can imagine, they had a significant the power shortage situation due to all the natural disasters. So actually, the diversifying power sources was considered an adaptation-related measure, although it does have a mitigation benefits as well. So that's very specific to, again, countries' situations, etc. Although it's not a SAP project, the another like 100% adaptation project we have in our portfolio, it's with the CABE, whereby CABE will be lending through the local financial institutions to smallholder farmers in Central America for them to help adopt the more climate resilient agricultural activities. And we are also providing some small grants as part of our system. So if these farmers and as well as the financial institutions meet some kind of milestones, then that there could be a cash award to again give them the further incentive to again to follow this type of practices. So that's a kind of example that I can think of now. But if you have a more innovative adaptation idea, we'll be more than happy to again brainstorm with you, because we private sector especially, we are actively always looking for adaptation project, which is not very easy task, given that it's very difficult to generate revenue stream for private sector partners. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer, Leo. We've actually had another question related also to adaptation and the private sector. And the question is like, what is GCF approach to encourage a more private sector investment in adaptation? I think you partially answered, like saying like feedback and communication is more than welcome, but please feel free to add any more comments to ways that private sector encourages adaptation projects.
Yeah, I mean, what we've done so far was not very sophisticated. Like I said, we are trying to encourage all the stakeholders to to adopt more climate resilient practices. It doesn't have to be only in the agricultural sector, but we are again very open to other opportunities out there. And we can never say that we have the answer to every question. So that's why I really want to welcome any suggestions, either from the audience or or anyone from within your network, to please come forward and bring your innovative ideas. And again, we'll be more than happy to brainstorm to develop innovative adaptation projects with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. And we welcome everybody to just post any feedback in the WUA platform on these SAP adaptation projects from the private sector. Another question that we have also for our private sector colleagues is what is the structure of finance, like grants or loans for private sector projects?
So when it comes to private sector, we do prefer minimizing deploying grants, because we do believe that maximizing the use of non-grant instruments is more appropriate for private sector engagement. But having said that, we do usually always provide grants for the capacity building and technical assistance. And like I said, we can even consider providing grants so that we can provide some kind of cash-based incentives to again encourage the private sector stakeholders. So there is no there's no a magic number, but I think on average, if you look at our portfolio, the amount of the proportion of grants compared to the non-grant portion in general is maybe up to 10% of the GCF PSF portfolio, and we'd like to again maybe provide more grants for public sector projects But again, related to the adaptation question, I think there is more justification for us to provide higher grant portion if we can bring more adaptation projects forward. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Leo. We've actually had like more questions from the audience also regarding these the extent of the grant support and for the SAP in the private sector. So I think you've also answered more than one question with that. I will now like to turn to our SAP colleagues. Let's give a bit of a rest to our PSF colleagues. And we've had some questions from the SAP from the technical assistance. So please, Dimitri, I would like you to provide a bit more of insights on how does the technical assistance work, who can actually access it, and just give our audience a bit of knowledge on that. For those of you who don't know all the acronyms GCF use, which are quite confusing, TA is technical assistance from our side. So please don't get confused with when we say TA. Thank you, Dimitri. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rossi, and thanks actually for these questions. Okay, it works like this. Who is eligible for GCF to basically pay or provide directly through a firm technical assistance through a consultant? Everybody that is an accredited entity that has put forward a SAP submissions can access this. But said that, please keep in mind that as a request from our board and also for, let's say, fairness, we normally envisage that are more what we call direct access entity, the entities that are accredited as national or regional entities to the GCF that normally are expected to use these instrument that the GCF for the SAP provides. Currently, we have provided this type of technical assistance through the deployment of single individual experts. I don't remember, but I think more than 10 SAP projects have been supported by this type of assistance that we have provided directly deploying the experts. We notice that we can do more in terms of tailoring this type of technical assistance to the different needs. And in fact, we are at the final stage through the support of the project preparation facility to hire a firm or more than one firms that will help us to deploy these experts. And through the use of these firms, basically, we can hire or deploy more niche type of experts or experts that, especially for the private sector, have an expertise that is really specific. The timeline that we have in mind is that possibly by the end of this year, these firms that specifically will provide technical assistance for SAP projects will be on board, and from 2021 will be in a position to deploy technical assistance using these firms. Over to you, Rossi.
Thank you, Dimitri. We've actually had a lot of questions on these technical assistance and also on capacity building. So I think your answer is really spot on. Thanks a lot. I will now turn to my PSF colleagues again, and I would like for them to talk about just a very practical questions, and I guess more than one person from our audience have this question. So maybe Kate or Leah, you can answer. From our audience is asking if they can send a draft concept note prior for submission for your team, to check the eligibility of that project idea for the PSF. Thank you.
Yeah, again, I mean, in principle, I think we did explain this before. We need to, of course, receive any concept notes officially by the accredited entity. But in some cases, we do engage directly with non-accredited entities as well. And then if we believe that the concept or project idea is interesting, then we can, make an introduction to a right accredited entity who may be interested in, sponsoring the program. Although, we will not be in a position to, push any AEs to sponsor the project only because we like it. So yeah, feel free to reach out to us if you have any interesting ideas, and what we can do is to provide you very preliminary feedback based on our criteria, and then we can again make a connection to the accredited entities. So that will be my response.
Thank you, Leo. So if I understood properly, yes, we encourage people to send their concept notes, especially if they come from an AE, and like the private sector is always open to give feedback. Our next question is related to, so the two projects that have been presented are from financial institutions. However, our participants would like to know if it's possible for other private companies, such as agribusiness, to request funding.
Yes, simple answer is yes. We are sharing these two cases because they happen to be from the financial institutions team, and I think one of the reasons why the financial institutions team tends to receive more SAP projects only because financial institutions are usually the ones who can really do this type of small scale projects. Whereas if you talk to multilateral development banks or other like a big commercial banks, they prefer doing like a large scale project. But again, having said that, there's nothing stops companies to be engaged with the GCF. So for example, we have one program with the EBRD, which was approved at the last board meeting, and that was actually a corporate program. So GCF will be providing loans to corporates, not through the financial institutions this time, provided that they can again make the operations more energy efficient and sustainable. So yeah, so simple answer is that we can definitely work directly with the corporates.
Thank you, Leo. The next question is also related to that, of like partnerships and like different forms of like submitting projects. So the next question comes from our audience, and is it possible for a UN agency, like that is also an accredited entity, to partner with the private sector AE, for example, a national commercial bank for a SAP project?
Yes, but what we prefer avoiding is to have two accredited entities, doing the same project, because we have tried that before, and it was a very complicated process, having two accredited entities on the same project. So what we are doing, and you might be able to see this project within next couple of days, that there will be two entities sponsoring almost the same project, but there will be two separate funding proposals because each entity will be doing the different activities. For example, this private sector AE will be obviously working on private sector related investments, whereas the UN agency will be taking care of like grant activities, including like capacity building support, etc. So you might be able to see this case soon, hopefully on Monday next week, because that's our publication deadline. So please stay tuned. But in other cases, what we prefer doing is to have again one accredited entity. It depending on the accreditation status. Some like private sector entities can do both grants and other non-grants instruments, whereas the UN agencies, if not all of them, they only do like project management using grants. So what we can explore is to work with this private sector accredited entity as the accredited entity, and then they can partner with one of these UN agencies as an executing entity to implement some of the TA or grant related activities downstream. So what that means is that the GCF will sign a legal agreement with that accredited entity only, we don't sign any legal agreement with an executing entity, but there will be a separate legal arrangement between the accredited entity and the executing entity. So if I use the financial flow, our funds will be channeled to the accredited entity, and then they will in turn channel this grant funding to this executing entity, which is a UN agency, who will be again then implementing very specific tasks on behalf of the accredited entity. Hopefully that wasn't too complicated. Try to again make it as easy as possible, but I do understand that it may not have been too easy to understand for some of you. Over to you.
Thank you, Leah. I think it was okay to understand. If not, please provide feedback in the OVALAU platform, and for sure we will stay tuned to the publication, which is again coming up on the 19th for the new projects that you mentioned. The next question for you is actually what are the eligibility criteria for a private sector project? Does it have to have any sort of a private shareholding structure?
We don't necessarily look at a shareholding structure per se, but of course, if because there are I guess many criteria when it comes to defining private versus public sector project. So, for example, a public sector institution can still do a private sector investment. One good example is the National Development Bank, which can be 100% sovereign owned, but many of them do private sector related activities. So that will still be classified as private sector investment because the beneficiaries are private sector. But what makes things a little bit complicated is about the instrument. So even if the beneficiaries are private sector and we'll be partnering with a National Development Bank to help them, but if there is a sovereign guarantee to cover the risk of this loan, so meaning that the countries will take the risk of the borrowing the loan from the GCF, then it will become a public sector project, because GCF will be taking a sovereign risk rather than the credit risk of the National Development Bank. Again, hopefully that's not too complicated, but because this is related to a structuring issue and the risk appetite. So again, simple answer to your question that the shareholding structure may or may not be too relevant, because I do understand that, for example, some of our AEs, such as Propaco, or they do look at the shareholding structure of their partner. So for them to be able to provide financing, the beneficiaries or borrowers of their financing have to be private sector owned. But we don't have that kind of criterion when we evaluate projects, especially to see whether we are working on a private sector versus private sector project. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you, Leo. I think that was a quite clear answer. So we're going to pose the last questions in this Q&A. We have two more questions from our audience. So the first one is, what type of projects are good for scaling up or replication in the context of the private sector?
Since I've been talking too much, I'll now let my colleague Kate to share her thoughts. Maybe she can talk about the FDB case where we, trying to scale up this agro-photovoltaic project beyond Fiji. Kate, over to you.
Just like I presented in my presentation, we are looking for pilot projects that has potential to be scaled up and replicated in other parts of the region. So in the case of FDB, they have potential to be implemented in other parts of the country where they face similar challenges, and they can also replicate this project in the seeds countries in the Pacific, where they also share similarities. Leo, do you have anything to add?
No, you're spot on. So yeah, we'd welcome, to explore, pilot project that can be scaled up. So that's kind of one of our mandates under our, paradigm shift, potential, for us to make sure that we do prioritize project that can be scaled up and replicated, across other parts of the world.
Thank you both, Kate and Leo. I wonder if Dimitri would also like to share his thoughts on like the scaling up and replicability of the SAP projects.
Well, thank you, Rossi. The scaling up, it's one of these three criteria that we have been given by the board decision on SAP on deciding if you are eligible or not to go for a SAP. And one of them is that, in fact, your project has the potential to scale up actions that have been proved in the context in which you want to operate to be transformational in order to achieve mitigation or adaptation results. At the same time, an element that emerged from the evaluation of the SAP that the independent evaluation unit of the GCF has done is that, in fact, the SAP has also the potential, using maybe a more private sector friendly terminology, of being an incubator of projects that then can be themselves scaled up by a regular proposal approval process, PAP, meaning a full-scale project that can take more risk, that can ask much more GCF amount of finance. And this is a reflection that, of course, we took on board, and that probably we will make use of this feedback that came, in fact, from many private sector partners and experts that have been interviewed during the IU evaluation, in order to reflect these lessons learned, these inputs in the hopefully incoming new SAP policy that, as I mentioned, we envisage to be tabled to the board by possibly early next year. Over to you, Rossi.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for answering all the questions. With this, we close the Q&A of this session. We will provide written feedback to the questions that were not answered live in WUVA. So I think that this presentation has been very good. We've heard about the SAP, an introduction to it, and the advantages that it can have for the private sector. And we invite you to access other sessions and side events of the conference, where you can hear our panelists, Leo Pat, again, he'll be talking in another event. And you can also explore the virtual networking features available in WUVA. We would like to thank you all for your participation, feedback, and questions. This session will still be open in WUVA, so you can still pose any more questions or feedback if you have in there. We invite you to visit our website, Green Climate Fund/events, to learn about this event and other past and upcoming events, and also to the GCF SAP website, where you will be able to have the link to all of the resources that our colleague Katie mentioned, as well as the recording of this webinar. So thank you all for participating in this side event. We look forward to hear from you with your project ideas, well, especially Kate and Leo. We hope that you enjoyed the rest of the conference. Stay safe and goodbye.